But I hope I'm not doing Oleg an injustice, I think when he's talking in terms that seem to imply a constructivist perspective, he's not thinking of the involuntary unconscious movements of the learning mind. He's thinking rather of the construction of a learning trajectory by an intentional learner. He identifies two teaching objectives. He says we need to help the learner to acquire the linguistic and communicative abilities he's defined for himself. And then we need to help the learner to acquire autonomy for himself, i.e. to learn to learn. And it's fairly clear from the text that those two things are thought of as being quite separate processes. According to this view, the crucial distinction is between teacher-directed and learner-directed learning, and the teacher's role is gradually to pass control to the learner until she or he reaches that perfect state which is encapsulated in his interpretation of what it means to take control of one's own learning. But this is what worried me from an early stage of my engagement with this concept of learner autonomy. There's no necessary link between the development of second language proficiency and the development of skills of self-management. And one way of describing my preoccupation with learner autonomy over the last God knows how many years is a search to find ways of resolving that, because I see it as a problem. Now, let's park Oleg for a moment and go on to the CEFR and what it implies about language teaching. Of course, what the Council of Europe will always begin by saying is it's not the function of the CEFR to promote one particular language teaching methodology, but instead to present options. And if you go to page 143 of the Cambridge University Press edition, you'll find there are 12, 13, 14 options. Now, anyone who has spent more than 5 minutes successfully teaching a language to one or more other people will know that most of those options are doomed to failure. But they're options, and it seems to be necessary to lay them out. But the fact is, of course, that the CEFR does have strong methodological implications. First of all, this picks up on something Kirsten Bod said in his words to us yesterday evening. It defines second language learning as a variety of second language use. I'm going to come back to that and the quotation where it says that in a minute or two. It uses these can-do descriptors to define proficiency, and in so doing implies a task-based approach to teaching and learning. More than that, the skills attached to the more advanced proficiency levels can only be developed on the basis of extensive use of the target language. When I wrote that when I was preparing this talk, I reached out for the framework, opened it at random, and the first C1 descriptor I found was in the scale for spoken interaction conversation, and that's what it says. Can use language flexibly and effectively for social purposes, including emotional, elusive, and coding usage. You don't get to make a successful joke in the second language on the basis of what a teacher tells you in a classroom. I don't think so, anyway. What's the difference between God and Bono? The answer is, God doesn't think he's Bono. I was told that by an 8-year-old. And her brother, who was listening, looked at her and then looked at me and said, "I don't get it." And the 8-year-old said, "No, neither do I." The CEFR's action-oriented approach agrees with mainstream theories of second language acquisition, which is that second language learning depends crucially on second language use. What about the CEFR and learner autonomy? Well, this is what the authors have to say. Learners are, of course, the persons ultimately concerned with language acquisition and learning processes. It's they who have to develop the competencies and strategies, insofar as they've not already done so, and carry out the tasks, activities, and processes needed to participate effectively in communicative events. But notice that learning is there implied to be a matter of participating in communicative events. However, relatively few learn proactively, taking initiatives, plan, structure, and execute their own learning processes. Most learn reactively, following the instructions and carrying out the activities prescribed for them by teachers and by textbooks. It's another of these Council of Europe ideal worlds, isn't it? Because teachers know that not only do learners not take any decisions for themselves, they don't do what you tell them either. However, it goes on, once teaching stops, further learning has to be autonomous. Autonomous learning can be promoted if learning to learn is regarded as an integral part of language learning, so that learners become increasingly aware of the way they learn, the options open to them, and the options that best suit them. And that, of course, reminds us of the lifelong learning, permanent education perspective. Even within the given institutional system, they can then be brought increasingly to make choices in respect of objectives, materials, and working methods in the light of their own needs, motivations, characteristics, and resources. Well, yippee. Hence, of course, the ELP, because the ELP was conceived as an instrument that could help to support those kinds of processes of autonomization. But there is still no link between self-management in learning and the development and exercise of second language proficiency. And compare with that the widespread practice of giving learners self-assessment checklists in their L1. The idea that you learn the language by communicating in it, but then you need to block that off and skip back into your L1 in order to undertake any form of evaluative reflection, including self-assessment. And the argument for that usually is, but their proficiency doesn't allow them to be profound enough. Seems to me, though, that the action-oriented approach of the CEFR and the way in which it's presented to us allows us to go a bit further. This is the definition of the action-oriented approach, which you find on page 9 of the CEFR in the English language version and the first of the text boxes in that chapter. Language use, embracing language learning. So again, language learning is a variety of language use, comprises the actions performed by persons who as individuals and as social agents develop a range of competencies, both general and in particular communicative language competencies. They draw on the competencies at their disposal in various contexts, under various conditions and under various constraints to engage in language activities involving language processes, to produce and or receive texts in relation to themes in specific domains, activating those strategies which seem most appropriate for carrying out the tasks to be accomplished. Monitoring of these actions by the participants leads to the reinforcement or modification of their competences. The words and phrases in boldface are, of course, the different dimensions importance of the descriptive apparatus the CEFR elaborates in chapters 4 and 5. I think one can summarize this and the relation between what we get in chapter 4 and what we get in chapter 5 of the CEFR by saying that second language proficiency develops from sustained interaction between the learner's competences and the communicative tasks whose performance requires him or her to use the target language. But note the last sentence. The monitoring of these actions by the participants leads to the reinforcement or modification of their competences. This is a description of language use, but also of language learning. It doesn't allow us, I think, to assume that this last sentence is talking about something which shifts gear from language learning through language use into some L1 activity. It seems to me that, understood in this way, the last sentence assigns a central role to second language use. A central role in second language use to the metacognitive function of monitoring. That ought to be of vital importance to anyone concerned with teaching languages to advanced levels in universities and other institutions. Because if you haven't got the capacity to use a language for metacognitive as well as communicative purposes, you've got a very, very primitive level of proficiency. It seems to me, you see, that we can say, well, yes, of course, Jana's right and Oleg's right. Learner autonomy is always a matter of self-management. And this always entails identifying learning targets, monitoring progress, and evaluating outcomes. But when the purpose of learning is the development of second language proficiency, then these metacognitive functions should, in my view, be fully integrated in the target language use on which effective learning depends. So it seems to me that we develop language learner autonomy because we're interested in developing learners' agency in the target language. That is to say, their capacity to make and implement choices, to reflect on learning processes, to evaluate learning outcomes. And, as I've already said, I think these are vital considerations for second language learning in higher education, and for me they would always be a central consideration in any reflection on how we use the CEFR in tertiary education, but especially on how we configure and mediate and expect to exploit the ELP. And the implication for ELP design, I think, is that checklists and other reflective elements should be presented to learners in the language or languages they're learning. Future of the CEFR and ELP, a role for self. I'm fond of saying, and some of you have probably heard me say it more than once, that the CEFR's most innovative feature is that each can-do descriptor can be used to specify a learning target, select and or develop learning activities and materials, and begin to shape the design of assessment tasks. And that brings curriculum, teaching, learning, and assessment into closer interdependence than has usually been the case. But then, and as I say this, I invite you to cast your minds back to the visions of that adult education project set out in Ollie Gunner's report. Learners are drawn into this cyclical dynamic by the checklists of ICANN descriptors that are used for goal setting and self-assessment in the ELP. But that happens provided that communicative curriculum goals are expressed in can-do terms. ICANN checklists explicitly reflect those goals, and rating criteria for assessment tasks are harmonious with the rating criteria that learners themselves use. in self-assessment. That kind of understanding of second language education and assessment culture is what I think the CEFR is challenging us to attempt. But I think that's a challenge already implied by the core values of the Council of Europe and the translation of those core values into those inspiring principles of adult education back in the 1970s. So here's the key challenge. Recall that, according to Janne, one of the objectives of adult education should be democratization. The actual work of learning, the acquisition of subject matter content implies a personal contribution, past experience, previous knowledge, pooled in the group as well as the help and assistance of a teacher. Now, what the CEFR is doing, I think, is challenging us to attempt the democratization of second language education by first of all developing curriculum guidelines, syllabuses that reflect learner needs, subjective but also objective needs, and explicitly accommodate learner initiative and control. By implementing those curricula in ways that foster learner autonomy, in the kind of understanding that I drew out of my analysis of the text box on page 9, and working towards this assessment culture where formal tests and exams exist on a continuum with teacher assessment, peer assessment, and learner self-assessment. Now, if we think about second language teaching and learning in higher education, I was wondering how you can divide that up. I'm sure you can think of many other ways, but it struck me that there are philological courses, linguistic and literary studies and the like, where the goal seems to me to be, or it should be, to make students at least temporary members of the community of philologists working in and through the L2 in question. And then there are area studies courses, things like European studies in the islands, part of which I inhabit, where the goal seems to be to require students to undertake at least part of their studies in one or more L2s. Languages for specific purposes, where the goal is to enable students to pursue professional activities arising from their academic studies through an appropriate second language, or institution-wide language programs where the goal is to give students the added value of developing proficiency in one or more second languages to promote their possibilities of mobility either while they're students or later on. That proficiency may or may not have a specific focus. Now, I'm getting fairly near the end. I'm saying that looking down there because he's held up. But let me just go back to some of the things that I said in part. It seems to me that in relation to these different kinds of course, we should be using the CEFR to reflect on what the development of communicative repertoires at different levels of proficiency actually entails, and what this implies for our curriculum goals. And our starting point there should be to seize with both hands this notion that language learning is a subcategory of language use. We should then be going on to specify the communicative learning outcomes in can-do terms, and we may need to do that in stages, to consider different kinds of language activity that students are going to have to engage in, language use, in order to learn, achieve outcomes. Find ways of ensuring that all learning is language learning. I spent the first 10 fairly useless years of my academic career in a department of German where you taught language. Well, that's what they said you were doing. It was translation, of course, from English into German once a week. And then you had what my professor used to call the academic side of the course, which they taught through English. I then said that if we've got these CEFR-based curriculum, we should use them to interpret generic ELP checklists in terms of the demands of different areas of specialized language use. I don't think we need endless descriptors, because we want descriptors to be true to the levels they're meant to belong to. And when you start to multiply them, you can quickly begin to drift away from those levels. What we need is a lot of interpretation of generic descriptors in terms of specific areas of language use. We need to make these checklists and their interpretation available to students, to develop goal setting and self-assessment procedures that are framed by the descriptors. Because once you get into B1, the descriptors talk about kinds of activity that are too extensive to be a short-term learning goal. So there has to be a serious effort to work out how you can break those descriptors down in terms of learning in order to give short-term goals. Ensure that other parts of the language biography also support reflective engagement with the curriculum, and structure the dossier to accommodate the different modules that make up the individual student's program of study. So, to Johan Fischer, whom I saw come in later on, who was asking these questions at the end of his introduction yesterday afternoon, yes, I do think that the time is ready to be, as it were, deconstructing and then reconstructing the Cercles version of the ELP, using those bits of it that are going to be most relevant and useful in the particular context you're working in. We should also use these curricula for working on tests and exams, developing rating grids. And having done that, we have to find a way of taking ELP self-assessment seriously. One of the things that Rolf discovered when he did the final report on the pilot projects and was going around asking learners was that learners were very, very keen on the idea of setting their own learning targets and assessing themselves. But they immediately said, with more or less suspicion depending on which country they happen to be in, but who's going to pay any attention to my self-assessment? Will it count for anything? Part of the democratization of the Council of Europe is always good. So I said then that Cercles should consider developing a sort of language curriculum framework, a generic version of the Cercles ELP to accommodate the kind of adjustments that Johan was already talking about yesterday, and a communicative language test development kit. In that last area, there has been progress because there is this volume recently published as an outcome of a 2-year ECML project coordinated by Johan Fischer. The references on the handout, so you don't even struggle to get it down. You may find it worth looking at that website if you haven't already done so. At the moment, you can get the hard copy, the printed copy of this from Council of Europe Publishing at the cost, I think, of €10. But if you can bear to wait 5 more months, you'll get it for nothing as a PDF from the ECML website. You see, some of these tasks are being undertaken here and there, and I'm looking forward to listening to some of the presentations, because unfortunately one can't hear them all, and seeing how much work is being done in these areas. But we do need to be quite explicitly applying the CEFR to the design of curricula in the way that I've briefly described. But then we need to start bringing the descriptors up to date. And those illustrative scales were developed back in the first half of the 1990s. If you look at the scales for written interaction, which aren't many in number, I think there's a mention of email, but there's absolutely nothing about texting and the various other forms of electronic communication, which in recent times have done a great deal to transform the way that people exploit whatever literacy they may have, sometimes may not have, in their own work, whatever about it too. And that needs to be done, even as one applies the principles and the existing scales of the CEFR. Find new ways of operationalizing the ELP. I'm sure electronic portfolios have fantastic virtues. I'm also sure that there are some things you can do with a paper portfolio that you'll never be able to do with an electronic one. And then do these things in relation to specific curricula. But then document and publish accounts of these and similar There is not nearly enough out there in the way of disciplined, clear, cogent description of how the CEFR has been used to do any of these things, how the implementation has worked, and so on. And it is important to undertake empirical or action research on implementation. Earlier this year I published an article in the journal Language Teaching setting out a possible research agenda for the CEFR for the next 10 years. The editor of the journal invited me to do that. If you're interested, you can actually, if you go to that URL, again it's on the handout, get that article for nothing because it's part of a promotional pack aimed at postgraduate students, and I'm sure you're all postgraduate students really. All of this is important because CEFR and ELP related research and development are essential if these two instruments are to thrive and evolve. One often gets the sense, even sometimes I think especially in Strasbourg, that people think, well, we've done the CEFR, that's that. And it's conquered the world, and it's translated to Chinese, so there we are. But that's really only the beginning, because it's got to be brought up to date, it's got to be kept, so that it is never lagging too far behind the realities of evolving modes and patterns of language use. CEFR has committed itself, I think, more strongly than any other organization to the CEFR and the ELP. And so CEFR as an organization needs to make good that commitment by doing some of these things that I've been talking about. There is this new journal, Language Learning in Higher Education, and I think this is precisely the kind of place where the accounts of how the ELP has been used, how the CEFR has been used, and so on and so forth, should be appearing. And a coherent program of research and development, starting in institutions, perhaps networking in a particular CEFR affiliate, and then internationally in CEFR itself. This is the best way of adding value to CEFR membership. It's also the best way of ensuring the coherence of future events of this kind and confirming the institution's international profile. It was meant to be time for questions, but it's coffee already. So I apologize for that. It is now over to you. Thank you very much.